Welcome back, biology, and today we're going to be talking about community ecology for chapter 20. When we talked about ecology and the different levels, we talked about the biosphere being the really big, broad level of the ecology. We talked about communities, we talked about populations, we talked about individual organisms. Well, we've been working our way back up, we talked about population ecology and how different populations fill their niche and how they kind of fulfill those roles. Now we're moving into community ecology, where we're talking all these different populations and meshing them together and seeing the interactions. So in this diagram here, it would be like the grasses interacting with the grasshoppers, interacting with the bluebirds and the snakes and the owls, and how all of those different things affect each other. So it is important to just recap real quick the species interactions that we see. So we have the individual, the population, up to community, ecosystem, and the biosphere. So populations are big, usually kind of groups of animals. There's a lot of bumblebees in an area, a lot of fish in an area. With this, communities tend to have lots of populations in them too, and they can have some communities have a lot, some have a dozen. So they all interact with each other in a large web. Some of it's the food web, some of it's like nitrogen cycle. Some of these interactions are positive, and they give a positive for a species, and some of them are negative, meaning they negatively affect another species. The first kind of interaction we see is predation, where an animal of one species, which we will consider the predator species, eats all or part of an individual for another species, the prey species. So this is a really big interacting force. This cheetah and this rabbit here. There's some really big things at stake here. The cheetah needs the food, and the rabbit would like to keep living. So it depends on if the cheetah is really good at hunting rabbits, that population is going to go way down. If that rabbit's really good at escaping, that cheetah population is going to be the one that goes down instead. So for our predators, if they are carnivores, they predate on animals. If they are herbivores, they are predators of plants. We'll kind of think of all of this as just organism level. So even though we don't think of like a cow as a predator, it is the top-notch grass predator on the planet. So many animals can be both predator and prey, and we can look at their interactions as such. Predators have some adaptations. So natural selection favors these adaptations for finding, capturing, and consuming prey. The better you are at catching food, the less you usually have to work for it, which means that you have more time to reproduce and make offspring. So some things that they have, some predator adaptations can be things like the sticky webs of spiders, the speed of a cheetah, the teeth of a wolf that are good for cutting and ripping. But their survival depends on their ability to catch and consume prey, so having these adaptations to do so is a big part of a predator's life. With that, if you're a prey species, you usually don't like to be eaten. So prey have adaptations to escape, hide, or use chemicals to protect themselves from predators. Prey species will also use something called mimicry, where one species closely resembles another. And there are two kinds. There's Batesian mimicry, where a harmless species resembles a more harmful one. So the king snake, which is non-venomous, is colored like the coral snake, which is venomous. So it is pretending to be this venomous thing in hopes that predators will eat it. The second type of mimicry is Mullerian mimicry, where we have two dangerous or two distasteful species that look similar. All of these bees have some amount of venom in them, but they are all the same color. So it kind of sends out the same message to all the birds in the area: hey, don't eat me. We're not as fun to eat as, like, say something like a butterfly or a moth or something that's not as brightly colored yellow and black as we are. It's kind of like a danger sign if you're driving on the highway. A huge interaction between species is competition, and an interspecific competition, this is where two or more species are using the same resource. So this would be like lions and hyenas are both eating zebras, or in this picture here, these zebras and the wildebeest are all competing for area on that watering hole to get some of that water. If there's competition, it is usually going to negatively, affect both species negatively. The species that is the better competitor, the one that is able to compete more, and it be successful more often is going to be the one that's usually found in the higher number of individuals in their population. With competition comes this kind of unique thing called competitive exclusion. And the first time that we had studied competition in the lab was a man named George F. Gauss, and he was studying competition in the lab. He was using two species of paramecium. The first one here, Paramecium aurelia, is the one that is pictured here, and he was doing another one called Paramecium caudatum. And really, you can think of these as organisms 1 and 2. And when he grew them separately away from each other, both of them thrived and reproduced and grew a number really, really well. But when he put the two species together, the Paramecium caudatum died out. It wasn't as good as competing for resources against Paramecium aurelia. So this competitive exclusion is this kind of principle that one species is better at using a resource, and therefore it kind of excludes or keeps the other people from using or organisms from using that same resource. Another example of a study done on these was using barnacles. This is Joseph Connell. This is a very famous study. He was on the Scottish coast looking at the sea line. He saw these barnacles, and he decided to figure out what was going on with these populations. So there are two species of barnacle that are really the popular varieties over in Scotland. They are Semibalanus balanoides and Cathalmus stellatus. And these are both species that are growing on the Scottish coast. The Cathalmus is the gray one here, and then Semibalanus is the blue one. So it's the gray. We'll talk about them gray and blue from here on out. They live in this area called the intertidal zone. And this is the area between the depth of low tide and high tide, how far that water goes up and down. So they will, little barnacles, when the water is over them, they'll open up, they'll eat. When it dries out, they'll close up and wait until the water to come back. So what he found is that the gray ones, Cathalmus, lived higher on the rocks than the blue ones. So he found that they could live in all areas of the zone, but when they were with the blue ones, the gray ones seemed to be higher up. They weren't as good as competing in the wetter, lower climates there. So they kind of took that little piece of that environment, and that was what they were really good, and the Semibalanus, the blue ones, weren't really good. So we talked about, and we talked a lot about the niche of a organism and where it lives and the role that it plays in its environment. When species come into interaction with other ones that have similar niches to them, they have this kind of two different niches that we talk about. The fundamental one is the entire area and set of environmental conditions that they can live in. So this gray one can live from the bottom of low tide all the way to the top of high tide. But it doesn't all the time, and especially not when it's competing. That's its realized niche. This is this area that it actually lives on when it's in competition with other people. So this is what it's really, really good at. It could live during the whole thing when the other one's not around, but usually they're found together, and usually they're in this kind of orientation. All right, the next kind of thing we're going to talk about is character displacement. And a character is any kind of physical attribute or kind of trait that a organism has. So it's these differences in a characteristic due to competition. So when we talk about Darwin, we talk about the Galapagos finches. These different beak sizes were characters that this Darwin was looking at. He was saying, okay, this different beak size is good at eating different seeds. Because of this, these guys are no longer competing for the same resource. One of them is eating all the small seeds, one of them is cracking open the big seeds, and they're not really sharing those resources between them. So now they don't have this competition for the same resource. So they're able to grow and reproduce and be more successful. Another way that organisms will kind of coexist is they will do something called resource partitioning, where they all use the same resource, but they all use different parts of this. So examples are like insects, larvae, and the adults will feed on different things. Caterpillars eat leaves. Usually the adults will eat something different. Now these two aren't competing with each other, so the offspring are able to grow up and be big and not compete with the adults that can fly and are way better suited for life. So another example would be birds using different part of the tree to search for same bugs. Here we have a whole bunch of bird species using a different part of the marsh. One of them's eating the grasses, one of them's filter feeding through the sand, one of them's eating the mollusks. So all of these guys are using the same resource, this marsh, but they're all using it differently so they can all live there and not compete with each other. When we talk about species and we get through predation and prey interactions, we have something called symbiosis. And this is this close, long-term relationship between two organisms. And symbiosis is a big category. We break it into three types. There's parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. So these are the three different types of symbiosis. In the first, parasitism, the host is harmed and the other organism benefits. This is a minus plus relationship. So it doesn't result in the immediate death for the host or death at all. Some parasites will feed on their host for a very long time. In this kind of image here, we have the same species of tick, but one of them has gorged himself much longer and has grown much fatter and larger. So even though they don't kill the human species, unless you get sick, and that's a whole different discussion. But just when they're stealing in their blood, they're not going to steal enough blood to kill you. So they're able to do this over a long period of time and get a lot of benefit out of you. There are two different types of parasites. We kind of break them apart based on where they live. They're either ectoparasites, where they live on the outside of the host, and these are things such as fleas and ticks and leeches and mosquitoes and all of these really good, really nasty little guys. And then we have endoparasites. These are things that live inside of the host, things like hookworms and roundworms, and is pictured here, tapeworms. So parasites always will have some kind of specialized anatomy for their parasitic lifestyle. Mosquitoes have their little proboscis that they get to draw blood with. These worms here have both uh, suckers and kind of attachment holders to attach to their prey so that they can continue to be parasites. Uh, while some of them are very less harmful, some of them can be very negative on the host. But luckily, as a host, as a creature, you have some defense against parasites. Your skin is a huge plate of armor over you. You produce tears that are really salty. Your saliva has some osmotic pressure to it. Mucus and your immune cells all fight against and try to prevent these parasitic infections. So you're not totally defenseless against them. In mutualism, we call this a plus-plus relationship because both species are getting a benefit from each other. And some of these mutualisms are so close that without the other species, the other organism doesn't do very well. A great example of mutualism is the acacia plant and ants. The acacia plant provides food and a place of home for the ants, and the ants protect the acacia from other insects and other predators. So both of these guys are getting a really big positive, and both of these guys do better when they're together. Another example of mutualism is pollination. So things like bees, butterflies, fleas, beetles, some bats, and some birds, like hummingbirds, are called pollinators because they carry pollen between plants. This is actually a mutualistic relationship because the plant is providing those guys with food, usually as nectar, that they then carry and they get to eat while they carry pollen from one flower to the next. And some of these are really, really cool. This kind of example here of this moth, his tongue, his proboscis there, is exactly the right length and exactly the right shape to get inside of this flower. So these guys have a very close relationship with each other. Some things like bees, where they land on it and get right in the pollen, are not as closely associated, but there's still a lot of studies going on about the color of flowers and the ability of bees to see those colors. And so lots of cool stuff going on there. All right, our last one is a plus neutral. And so it's just a plus and then equal. This is where one species benefits and the other is neither harm nor help. So commensalism is these guys kind of, the very classic one is the stingray here, and there's remora that are hanging off the bottom of it. The remora are getting a ride, and they're getting to, feed along with the stingray and get his scraps, but he's not really getting anything out of it. Another example is cattle egrets and buffalo. Cattle egrets are little birds. They benefit from the buffalo because as the buffalo are feeding, they spook out insects, they spook out lizards, and they eat those insects and lizards that they normally would have a harder time finding. Sometimes, though, they get really, really gray, whether they're commensal or mutualistic or parasitic, because cattle egrets will sometimes eat ticks and other things off of buffaloes, so that would be mutualism then. But most of the time, the relationship isn't that kind of dynamic. So we go off of what happens most of the time. All right, we're going to switch gears here for the second part of this chapter. We're going to talk about patterns in communities. When we look at communities and we kind of discuss them, we look at several different measures. The first is species richness. How many number of species are in a community? A dog's a species, a cat's a species, a fox is a species. So we can get a lot of different species. And then species evenness is the abundance of those species. Do we have all one species and then a tiny bit the other species? Are they all 25% of this community? How much of each one do we have? So when we look at species richness and we look at this image up here, uh, both of these forests have 4 species in them. One of them has all of these species spread out and we have about an equal number. The other doesn't. So when we look at species richness, this is just a simple count of the species in the community. If there's one organism, it counts as one. So if we have one blue jay in the area, that's one the blue jay species gets counted. So looking at these two, you can kind of see the difference between both of these have the same species richness, but have a very different species evenness. So when we talk about species richness, there's this connection between latitude, the north and south, kind of where you are on the globe, and how much species richness you have. So as a general rule, the closer you get to the equator, the more species a community will have. Species richness is greatest in one type of biome, and that is the tropical rainforests. This kind of was kind of found and kind of shown by entomologists Edward Olson and Terry Irwin. They were looking in Peru for different species of insect, and they found that there was the same amount of species in a single tree in Peru as you could find in the entire British Islands. So all of English, Scotland, Wales, all that area. The reason for this increased species richness is the equator stays more temperate the entire year round. It's kind of more stable. It didn't freeze during the ice ages. And so we have lots of time and ability for these guys to continually specialize to greater and greater degrees and get more speciation going on. There's also more energy available because these plants are able to photosynthesize year round. They don't have to lose their leaves or go through a dormancy period. So there's more food and energy available for these guys. Another thing that it kind of affects species richness is how big the habitat is. And the kind of correlation here is the larger the area you have, the more species will be found there. We call this the species area effect, and this is most often used when we're talking about islands or isolated pieces of geography, valleys in between mountains, stuff like that. So in the Caribbean, you have the larger islands and the smaller ones. The larger ones have a lot more species than the smaller ones do, even though they're on the same latitude. And that's what this graph kind of shows here. You can see that as you get up closer to the 70 meters squared there, you get a lot more species, right around 30, compared to very, very small areas that only have 15. So some other things that go on, some species interactions. Everything's connected in an ecosystem, and all these communities have lots of interactions going on. This can affect the species richness and the composition of that uh, kind of ecosystem. So predators are really important to an ecosystem. They can prevent a competitive exclusion among their prey. They can prevent these guys from being wiped out. So Robert Payne showed the importance of a sea star. The scientific name there is Pisaster opraeus. But this sea star was really, really important in maintaining species richness of communities off the Washington coast. When he removed this thing from the environment and prevented it from coming back in, He found that the mussel Mysticis californicus became much more abundant, spread over the habitat. It crowded out all the other species, and it took these really, really healthy population of 20 species, and it fell down to about 5. So 15 of these species were excluded just because the starfish wasn't around to keep that mussel at bay. So this guy was very important to this ecosystem. Uh, we have stability inside of communities, and then we have what are called disturbances. And the stability of a community also kind of affects its species richness. So a disturbance is any event that changes the community, removes or destroys organisms, or alters resource availability. And there can be either abiotic, these non-living disturbances, things like droughts, things like fires, floods, volcanoes, earthquakes, and storms, are all really, really detrimental to some of the environment, some of the community, and others not. So as that community tries to recover from that disturbance, there can be some loss of species, which so you can lose species. Certain grasses all get burnt up or all freeze. In addition, you can have biotic disturbances, things like animals, things like elephants tearing up trees, and beavers making dams, prairie dogs moving soil around when they're digging their burrows. All of these things affect the environment and therefore affect all of the communities that are using that. They affect the earthworms and the bacteria and the plant roots that are inside of the soil. Humans are really good at creating disturbances in ecosystems. We bulldoze, we clear cut, we pave, we plow, we mow. All of these things uh, affect that environment. And for some species, that's good, and for others, that's not good. So, what populations do these disturbances affect? And all communities are going to get some disturbance at some point in time. And some of these organisms inside of these communities depend on these disturbances to survive. A good example around here is the lodgepole pine. It needs periodic fire to disperse its cones and pop those open to disperse its seeds. So until it gets fire, that tough resin seal around the cone won't be cracked open. So once we get this fire that sweeps through an area, usually these lodgepole pines are the first one to sprout and start to have this opportunity to get sunlight and sort of grow into the canopy before it gets all this old growth forest around it. So we've talked about disturbances. The opposite of disturbances is stability, and this is the tendency of a community to maintain relatively constant conditions. So it's the ability to resist disturbances. When a disturbance happens, you don't lose all of a species. The populations bounce back. That's a stable community. So this also is related to species richness. This is a really big species richness is a really big theme for this chapter. When we talk about growing a crop, this picture here of all these corn, all this head of corn, this is very low stability, very low species richness. If we had a disease that goes through that affects only corn, this whole community will be wiped out. What I've shown in the second picture there is a picture of all of the members of a community inside of a temperate forest. So something like around here. So it has a lot of different moving pieces there where if something happens, like if a predatory insect comes in, uh, the pine trees might take a little bit of a hit if it's a pine beetle, but the rest of the ecosystem will stay in balance. And maybe some of the predators that eat pine beetles will start to grow a number and kind of take care of that problem itself. So having more species in an area makes it more stable, makes it better suited to kind of resist these changes and these disturbances. We said though that disturbances did happen, and what happens once we take a forest fire and we just totally wipe out and decimate all the life out of an area. We get this process called succession, and where we have this regrowth of community of species in an area. And there's two types of succession. There's primary succession, and this is in a community or an area that has not supported life previously. So this is something like an island, a brand new island, bare rock, like a lava flow, a sand dune, anything that there's no soil down. And then secondary succession, I think of the secondary succession to mean soil. That's on a nice S and S tie there. But this is the sequential replacement of species after an existing community like a forest is wiped out. So we already have soil, we don't have to make soil. So it's just how things come back and repopulate that soil. So things that cause secondary succession are things like forest fires, farming, logging, mining to some extent, as long as they don't take the soil away. All of these things have soil that then they're able to grow back in. With this, when we have a disturbance happen, we usually get a species that comes first, and these guys are called pioneer species. So any new habitat, whether it's an empty pond formed by rain, a freshly plowed field, or newly exposed bedrock, is an invitation to these pioneer species to start the process of succession. So these guys are usually adapted to new conditions and dominate very quickly. They grow fast. They don't need a lot of resources. They tend to be really small. They tend to reproduce quickly. This makes them really good at invading and occupying disturbed habitat. You can see here on this picture from a Hawaiian island, we have this flower taking over this kind of lava flat here. You can see in the background that that volcano still is hot. It is still uh, active volcano, but these grasses are already starting to grow in this lava field here, trying to find a place for them to grow and to reproduce. A great example of primary succession that is close to home-ish is the Canadian Shield. It is an example of primary succession because there was no soil on the Canadian Shield. While the Canadian Shield is very old, it was just a big slab of rock that didn't have a lot of plant life or animals or anything on there. So, because of this, there's not a lot of there's no soil, there's not a lot of minerals or nutrients that are available to kind of support plants. As the glaciers, kind of retreated back up into northern Canada and left all this rock bare, we had this kind of area that didn't have any life on it. So plants couldn't live there, animals weren't there. But after time, we started to get this kind of frost wedging, and we froze the rock and broke it apart and thawed it and broke it apart and froze it again until now we had these kind of smaller pieces that had more minerals available. With this kind of now opportunity, lichens were able to move in there, and lichens are these very cool symbiotic relationship between fungi and algae. And what they do is they're able to photosynthesize and then pull nutrients out of very, very nutrient poor areas. But as they continued to grow, they made acids that broke down the rock, and they continued to free these minerals inside of there. As these lichens continued to grow and die on top of themselves, they made a lot of organic matter, where we finally got enough soil to get grasses to grow. As those grasses grew and died and reproduced, they created more and more organic matter, and we get enough to have enough soil to get bushes and trees to start growing. And now the Canadian Shield has large animals, has trees growing in it, has a lot of life happening on it. This picture here is from the Canadian Shield. So life has found a way to take back this kind of area here. In secondary succession, this usually happens a lot faster because we had an existing community. It was cleared by disturbance, such as forest fire, but we still have soil available. So this ecosystem will return. Usually it's things like weeds move in, then annual grasses, these ones that grow every year, and dandelions that were carried by wind or animals. Then as there's more, these more and more kind of soil and this kind of disturbance is covered over, we get shrubs, we get trees, and eventually we get a forest. And as that forest continues to mature and we get older and older forests until we get back to uh, the kind of last stage, which was the climax community. And this is probably what this started at before we had this forest fire. This secondary succession can take 100 years, it can take up to 300 years. It can take a lot longer depending on environmental things, but it can happen pretty quickly compared to your primary succession. There is some complexity to succession, but as this continues, we reach the stable endpoint we kind of already talked about, the climax community. Uh, the important part with both successions is that the organisms in the prior stages kind of set up the stage for the next group of organisms to take over. The grasses make more soil so that the bushes can survive there. the grasses make enough soil so that the rabbits can come in, so that then the coyotes can hunt them. So each step is kind of paving the way to the next one. And eventually you get to something like this picture here, which is a climax community where you have lots of species richness, and this kind of ecosystem has healed back to its original state. This is the conclusion, the end of chapter 20 here. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.